As I waited for the kettle's keen, I took a moment to reflect on my future. Later, I'd have to phone the agency and let them know I was back on the market. Bless Mrs. Elm. She had steadfastly requested only me for the last 7 years. The agency didn't like that, preferring that clients not get too attached to caregivers. But Mrs. Elm, in her quiet way, was a force to be reckoned with. She had a steadfast persistence in achieving her own way. I wiped at sudden tears. This is why they don't like staff to stay too long with one client, I scolded myself. Before long, you start thinking you're one of the family and not just the help. I took out her second-best china cups and poured fragrant tea into them. I even remembered the milk and honey for Giselle. Someone knocked at the front door, and I peeked my head through the kitchen entryway in time to see Giselle open up for Dr. Fineworth. She murmured something to him, and he nodded. He patted her arm in a comforting way. Joshua appeared, and Dr. Fineworth shook his hand and offered condolences. Joshua led him into Mrs. Elm's room. Giselle came into the kitchen, rubbing her arms as though she was cold. "Never seen a dead person before," she mumbled. I pursed my lips. "You haven't been in this line of work long then," I said, handing her one of the cups. She glanced at me from under her lashes, and I couldn't quite read her expression. She sat at the kitchen table, and her shoulders slumped. She was dressed in a mini skirt, stockings, and one of those cropped jackets that were in fashion this year. I glanced at the little owl clock over the stove. It was just going on 6:45 a.m., and she was fully dressed and made up already. Not easy keeping up appearances. I sipped the hot tea, and the flavor invigorated me. Dr. Fineworth strolled into the kitchen. "Any chance I could have one of those?" His baritone voice was an added bonus to a handsome man in his late 40s. I often thought that if I was 20 years younger, I would flirt with him outrageously. He had that sort of Italian count look from the romance novels I used to devour. Wavy black hair with graying temples, aquiline features, tall and well-built. Giselle was looking at him with something like awe. Guess she'd forgotten she was Joshua's fiancée. "I've signed the death certificate, and the ambulance is on its way. I'm sorry, Hope. You were a good nurse to her." He sat at the table and covered my hand briefly with his own. We shared that brief moment of mourning together, and then he took his hand away to pour himself a cup. "Was it her heart?" I asked. He nodded. "She hasn't been enjoying the best of health recently," he explained. "She was fine when I left for holidays," I muttered. Giselle shot me a look of pure hatred. I sipped my tea. I'd say she passed around 1 or 2 a.m. He swallowed his tea hurriedly and stood up. Giselle half rose, but sank down again as he asked me to show him out. "I can recommend you for another position, Hope. You're excellent at your work, and Mrs. Elm had nothing but high praise for you," he said as we stood near the front door. He glanced back at the kitchen where Giselle was openly staring at us. "You don't have to stay here. I can help you get another client in no time," he said kindly. He flashed me his pearly whites and left. The day was bright and quite sunny, and yet I felt every minute as an agony. Once Mrs. Elm's body was taken away, Giselle and Joshua got over their shock quickly. They were back on the couch, watching TV at a ridiculous volume and chain-smoking. I called my agency and was promised they would have me situated soon. I almost cried again when the receptionist warmly offered her condolences. They all knew how much I loved Mrs. Elm. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Joshua knocked on my bedroom door for the second time that day. "Hope, could you make all the arrangements for Aunt June?" He avoided my eyes. "You're her only living relative, Joshua. There are some decisions you'll have to make," I said. "I can't. I don't know what I should do, and Giselle says she wants nothing to do with it. Aunt June really liked you, you know." He trailed off. He said the latter part as though it was incomprehensible. I licked my dry lips. It's not as though I had another job lined up to go to right away, or even a home of my own. I had sold it to help finance my surgeon daughter's expensive education. I realized I hadn't called her yet. Joshua shifted uncomfortably, and I sighed. You'll have to call the parson and the funeral parlor, the florist, and... You're sure there's no other family that should know? I asked. No, after my parents passed, she was my only living relative. That's why I came here. We were all each other had in the world. It would have sounded more pitiful if I hadn't seen him loaf about and sponge off his aunt's kindness for years. She had lots of friends in the village. We will have to have a wake. My brain switched to organization mode. Joshua's expression of relief was almost comical. He half turned to go and then made an awkward show of suddenly remembering something. Yes, we should also call her solicitor. About the will, he said. That is something you will have to handle, I said firmly. The woman was barely cold, and true to form, here he was trying to get his grasping hands on her little savings. I shut my door. It took me an hour to get things arranged, which wasn't hard in such a small village. 1 funeral parlor, 1 florist, 1 Anglican chapel, and yes, 1 solicitor. Giselle prowled around the kitchen, impatiently waiting for me to finish my calls. She began chain-smoking, but stomped off when I glared at her. When I was finally done, I stretched, feeling kinks in my neck and back. I stared around the kitchen, which was filled with Mrs. Elm's little treasures. Her ceramic rooster collection, her beloved china plates which adorned the walls, the copper pots shone in the sunset rays, and the cheerful yellow and white gingham curtains tied back with crochet ties. She had made them herself. I admired her. A wartime nurse who had lost the love of her life, James, in their first year of marriage. She had committed most of her years to serving her beloved community as the village nurse. She had retired just as Dr. Fineworth had taken over the local practice. After that, she had dedicated herself to nurturing her garden and tending James' beautiful roses. She lived for that garden. I felt anger constrict my throat. Was it really a surprise that she had lost her will to live? They had as good as murdered her when they destroyed the garden. It was Joshua's bad luck to come into the kitchen at that moment. Giselle says you're making supper? She's starved. I closed my eyes and swallowed hard. Why did you destroy her roses? He gaped and then looked at the ground. I could see the flush rising up his pale neck. I told you. Giselle has allergies, he said truculently. Make your own supper. I'm not your maid, I said. He backed out of the door, and I heard him mutter something to Giselle and her outraged retort. I walked into the parlor ready for battle. What's the use of you being here? She demanded. I was almost drowned by the strong perfume. Allergies my foot. Why don't you get back on your boat and go back to where you came from? She looked smug, as though she had invented this particularly juicy brand of racism. To be fair, I had come to England on a boat. Almost 40 years ago, my best friend and I had sailed to England with plans to go from nannies to nurses. She had stuck to the plan, but I met my husband, and his particular brand of sexism had derailed me. I'm as British as you are, love. This is my country, I said quietly. She laughed an ugly, mocking sound. See what happens when you let all sorts in. They come in, take our jobs, and then they think they've got rights, she mocked, directing her comments to Joshua. She leaned into my face. The hate in her hard grey eyes skewered me. Soon as the old girl is in the ground, get out of my house. This was an unnecessary demand, considering she already knew I'd be moving to a new job soon. It's not your house. I decided to be just as petty. Suddenly, I remembered Mrs. Elm's whispered words to me. She wants the cottage. Strange ideas began to form in my mind. No, that was just ridiculous. Who would kill for a little cottage that was almost 100 years old? It was comfortable and cozy, but it wouldn't be worth much. Certainly not the life of a good woman. I walked past Giselle, grabbed my coat and left the cottage. I glanced at the mangled garden and spotted something odd. Someone had dug a large hole at the far left corner of the garden. Whoever had done it, I assumed it was Joshua, had completely uprooted one of the rose bushes to make the hole. I sighed. It wasn't my business. The late afternoon sun was still bright, and the crisp fall breeze was not unpleasant. I walked down the cobblestone sidewalk into the heart of the village and went to my favorite tea shop. The owner smiled at me as I came in. "Scones are fresh out the oven, Hope." "You've got good timing," Mrs. Waite said as I sat down at one of the little round tables. She was originally Swedish or Norwegian and had a very minimalist taste in decor. White walls, white lace tablecloths, and fresh flowers on the tables. Even the china was unadorned. There was none of the bric-a-brac you'd expect in an old-style tea shop. It was a welcome haven. There were several other patrons there, but I ignored them. Few had gone out of their way to befriend Mrs. Elm's black Barbadian caretaker. Small villages tended to be insular. I had a few acquaintances here, and that was fine. Mrs. Waite brought a 2-tiered tea tray and a teapot with hot water. I thanked her warmly and poured out the steaming liquid into my teacup. I dunked a tea bag in it and took it out just as the water became a light honey color. I added milk and half a teaspoon of sugar. As I drank, I felt refreshed and I inhaled the earthy aroma. I nibbled on the cucumber sandwiches, broke open the warm, delicious scones, and slathered them with raspberry jam and clotted cream. I realized that I hadn't eaten much over the last 24 hours. I spent a glorious hour just observing the comings and goings of village life through the window of the tea shop. I walked back to the cottage and turned my key in the lock resignedly. The two of them were sitting on the sofa mindlessly staring at the TV. Joshua tore his gaze away long enough to address me. "I've called the funeral parlor and asked them to cremate her instead. We'll have a memorial tomorrow afternoon. You can come, I guess," he said. "And then get out," Giselle added. She never took her eyes off the screen. I was certain Mrs. Elm would never have wanted to be cremated, but at the end of the day I had no say. Much later, as I lay in bed trying to chase down elusive sleep, the thought came back to me. Could they want her cremated to hide evidence of poison? Well, no. Dr. Fineworth would have found something suspicious. He was an excellent doctor. Still, maybe they had used some exotic poison that couldn't be easily traced. I stooped and tried to turn off my brain.